They say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but the chance to chat with writer, producer and comedy guru Paul Hawksbee was just too good an opportunity to pass up. And Paul proved to be as generous a guest as he is a co-host of the Hawksbee and Jacobs daily radio show. Paul has had a long and fascinating career as a comedy writer, working with legends like the Two Ronnies, Frankie Howerd and more recently Harry Hill. He co-created the iconic football magazine 90 Minutes, worked at Chelsea Football Club with the infamous chairman Ken Bates, and was part of the team that brought us Fantasy World Cup on ITV. So we had a lot of ground to cover before we paid our own Tottenham Hotspur-inspired tribute to one of the great game show formats. Enjoy. Hi Paul, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much, Danny. Yeah, good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question. So my question to you is this, because your career spans both sport and comedy, but the comedic side and the writing side is obviously a very rich vein. So if you could have written for any performer or any show that you didn't actually get to write for, which one would you choose?
Wow, that's a very good question. I love Porridge, the sitcom Porridge. There'd be two, possibly. I love Clement and Lafrene's writing from sort of Likely Lads and beyond. And I'd love to have written on Porridge. I'd love to have had the possibility to get stuck into an episode. I think I might have been able to find the voice, but I would say that. But they were geniuses and still are. And also something pioneering. I was lucky enough to meet Alan Simpson. He was a guest on the show a couple of times when he was at Hampton and Richmond involved with the club, just to spend a bit of time with him. So to be a pioneer in something, to do something as original as Hancock, the idea of being able to have said, boys, let us do an episode, let me do an episode, that would have been nice. So I always I remember years later, I was even thinking recently with everything that was going on with Liz Truss, and like when everything's a complete disaster, you could imagine sort of Hancock saying, right, I've had enough. I'm going to 10 Downing Street. I'm going to sort this out. Knocks on the door and says, now, look here, my good lady, you've crashed the economy. And he says, hang on, I know that blonde wig anywhere. Sid James, I might have known. It's just, you can just, it still works as a dynamic between those characters. So I still think it's got legs now.
Very good. So you were obviously influenced by comedy at that time, and I'm really interested to know, how did a guy or a young man growing up in Edmonton end up becoming a comedy writer, because the pathway doesn't seem so obvious?
Yeah, well, I was born in Stoke Newington, when Stoke Newington was a pretty different place back then, and I moved to Edmonton. I was about 9. And I was doing sort of various things at that time. I did odd sort of bits and pieces. I worked in a music shop because I sort of played keyboards in a band at that time. So I was playing in the band in the evenings. And I started to do a bit of writing from a journalistic point of view. And an old schoolmate of mine was working on Spitting Images, just got basically a job almost as like a researcher's job. He'd started off just sort of sweeping up in the workshops where they were making the puppets, and then got a researcher's role. And he just contacted me out of the blue. I saw him at a mutual friend's house, and he said, I'd quite like to write some stuff. And I said, I watched Spitting Images. I think it was only the first couple of series. And I said, yeah, that would be fun. So we just wrote some bits and pieces, and we got some encouragement from the guys who were the script editors at the time, who were Rob Grant and Doug Naylor, who wrote Red Dwarf as well. They were very supportive and helpful. And we entered a competition, a BBC competition, Sounds Funny competition. You had to write a half-hour script. And we wrote a pretty sort of traditional sitcom script. To cut a long story short, we finished about 3rd out of the 5. But I think our one was the only one to get made into a series. So we did get a series on radio, writing that sitcom. And from that, I don't know, I just sort of, the BBC have a kind of, it's a sort of annual award they give out to, it used to be the 3 writers. I think they still do it. 3 writers every year. and Rob Grant and Doug Naylor had done it. Hunter and Doherty had done it. Jimmy Mulville, Rory McGrath had done it in the past. And they would basically give you, it's about $5,000. This is when was this, about 86, something like that. They give you $5,000 for the year. And you need never turn up again if you don't want to, but you'd be a bit of an idiot because it was an opportunity at an office at Langham Place, just around the corner from Broadcasting House as it was. And you could write your own stuff, produce your own stuff, put it in to get commissioned, and you could write on other shows. So the things like the news headlines were around, and weekending, and also we wrote a series for Frankie Howerd. So you got to do stuff like that during that year. And from that point, I don't know, I always kind of kept my head in. I wrote a couple of plays for Radio 4. Then I started to do a bit more writing. I wrote a couple of sports things, and then I sort of started to write more sport, and that's how kind of 90 Minutes, the magazine that I started, came about. But then I went back to writing later on for Harry Hill and stuff. But that was the start. It was just a chance for somebody who was working in TV, and we thought we might have a chance. So that was the thing that got me into it.
Did you ever think about becoming a performer?
No, it's funny that I do the show with Charlie, but I always say we get lots and lots of stand-up comedians on the show because we're football fans of stand-up comedians that come on, and I can't do it. I've gone back to my old school and did a sort of presentation, and I don't know, I get nervous. I find it quite difficult to perform in front of an audience. It's really odd. Every day I take it there's people out there listening to the radio show. The figures say there are. I can't hear anybody not laughing or groaning or turning it off. So maybe it's that fear of rejection of facing people down. And I mean, the times I've done it, it's gone okay, just for sort of speeches and stuff. But no, it's not for me. Performing, not for me.
You were exposed to some very big talent from quite early on, the likes of the Two Ronnies and Frankie Howerd. Was that a bit of a baptism of fire, or were they very welcoming? What was that experience like?
Well, the Two Ronnies was weird because I was working on, myself and the guy David, who I'd written the stuff for Spitting Image for. We were up in Manchester working on a Bernie Clifton show, radio show for Radio 2. Again, as part of that writers thing, you were just sort of jobbing writers, and things came along, projects came along. He said, "Yeah, it's a good learning experience," and it was good fun. But I mean, obviously, quite a lot of Bernie's act was based on the ostrich legs. Not great for radio. But he was good, and he was very welcoming and supportive. But we came back one night. We started to write this kind of idea, this Hell's Angels barn dance for Bernie. And we was writing it, and we said, this is a bit of a big production. And one of us said, this is a Ronnies thing. This is a musical number at the end of the Two Ronnies. So it's that kind of folly of youth. Most of the time you think, well, Two Ronnies won't perform anything. A pair of no marks like us are going to suddenly send them out of the blue. But we were sort of doing a bit of writing at the Beeb, and we thought, look, let's just phone somebody up. Well, we phoned one of the secretaries up in radio and said, have you got a number for Michael Hurl, who was the producer? And we got a fax number, and we just sent it over with a covering letter. Said, we've written this. It's not right for what we're doing now, but we think it's a Two Ronnies musical number. Would you have a look at it? Completely uncommissioned, which is really not the way that show would ever work. But then the following day, we got a phone call, and it was Michael Hurl saying, you're in luck. But Ronnie Barker had seen it in the office. They need one more musical number for the series, and he likes it, and it's in. So I felt like I scored the winning goal in the cup final. I was a massive fan of his. I love Porridge, and he's a great performer. And as we discovered, a writer as well, as Gerald Wiley, he would sort of script edit quite a lot of it. So we wrote this kind of Hell's Angels barn dance number. When we went and watched it recorded, it was, not a major rewrite, but it had a fairly chunky rewrite. So it was a bit disappointing at first. We sat there thinking every word. Again, that was part of that process of learning that, good writers and good script editors will get hold of your work and tailor it to them, and performers will as well. Frankie Howerd, we wrote the series with. It was his last series for radio. And yeah, that was a great experience because it made me kind of realize that when you watched him on stage, when you watched him work a crowd, he was just fantastic at it. I mean, it's that old thing of reading out the telephone directory and getting laughs, and he was capable of that. So could be a bit difficult to work with. There were some mood swings there, but again, he was very supportive of us.
So, as you mentioned earlier, in 1990, you co-founded the iconic football magazine 90
Mm.
Minutes. Had you written about football before?
Yeah, I mean Dan Goldstein, who started 90 Minutes with me, we'd written a couple of sort of one-shot magazines around the European Championships and the World Cup. So just one-off magazines for a publisher that would be on the bookshelves just for those tournaments. There was we felt there was a gap in the market because the fanzines, I mean, When Saturday Comes was great and was covering that sort of market. Then there was nothing else until you got to Shoot and Match and the kind of kids magazines. So there was no kind of halfway house of a kind of adult weekly. And we wondered whether there was space to do something that kind of bridged that gap. And, to cut a long story short, we went and we pursued it. We did a dummy. We got some interest in it. We borrowed a little bit of money from the bank. We found somewhere to print it. Desktop publishing was very new. We had just a couple of very basic Apple Macs. And it was without that, we couldn't have done it. If it had to be typeset and it would cost so much more money, we found somebody who could produce it on that basis for us. And we started this magazine. I mean, again, it's sort of folly of youth and not particularly knowing what you're doing because it was a mad idea. The whole idea of two blokes in a back room in Blackheath producing a weekly magazine was ridiculous. I mean, I'd never do it now. After a while, after a few months, we realised it was killing us because we were trying to run the business, write quite a lot of the magazine, deal with the freelancers that had come to us when they'd seen the early editions. And so we went in search of a bit of help. We wrote to a couple of publishers. The publishers of Viz at that time said they liked the idea, but they weren't in a position to do anything about it. The other one was Dennis Publishing, which was run by a guy called Felix Dennis. Felix wasn't a football fan, but there was people at Dennis that were. They took 90 Minutes on. They made it. They kind of ironed out a lot of our mistakes. I think we focused the magazine a bit more to a kind of older teenage, something that kind of led you through maybe into different older magazines, but something that took you from Shoot and Match and had a slightly more adult take on it without being just too bland. But as I said, and then the alternatives were good stuff like When Saturday Comes that obviously are still out there. But yeah, so that's how I ended up sort of producing the football magazine. And then Dennis sold. I mean, he always told us about another publisher, EMAP, that had said to him, he went out to dinner with him the day he bought 90 Minutes. And he said, you'll rue the day that you bought a football magazine. It's a daft idea. It's a waste of time. And he said that years and years later, when it was sold to IPC, he felt quite smug about that. He always backed himself to make something work. So, we went to the biggest publishing company in the country at that time, really, IPC Magazines.
You started this magazine yourself, but then ultimately you had to let it go and for it to thrive. And you'd gone from a medium-sized publisher to a massive publisher like IPC. So there's lots of cultural shifts going on in the way that you're operating, and this is the period of Loaded and sort of anarchy going on there in some ways with those guys. But it's a big corporate organization. So was it a tough transition to go through all these different environments?
No, not really. I mean, we were quite lucky. They really wanted 90 Minutes. They could see they wanted to corner the market in football magazines, and they had Shoot and they had World Soccer. They also had a thing called Soccer Stars, which is kind of kids poster magazine, and they could see that 90 Minutes was carving up a couple of their markets. So they thought, they'd rather have 90 Minutes in their stable, which is why they came to Dennis to buy it. They could see this whole kind of taking, from sort of cradle, not quite to grave, but potentially taking the reader right through, covering all their needs from a football point of view. And that was their strategy. So they were really wanted us, really wanted the team, were very welcoming, very supportive. They never tried to change anything. James Brown's book's out, just come out, and we were in the next office to Loaded as they worked up that dummy issue, and then their permanent office was right next to 90 Minutes, and they kind of left us alone. We weren't in the main IPC tower. We were over in this little kind of satellite building over the road. They just which was a lot of fun, because we had a lot of fun with those guys. The team we recruited, a lot of them were people that were big music fans as well as football fans. We wanted to try and create this kind of smash hits for football. So we had people who'd worked on Sounds, Record Mirror, later people who worked on NME. So yeah, we wanted this. It wasn't it wasn't really a music. It was a football magazine, but we wanted those kind of sensibilities and stuff like smash hits. That's what we wanted it to be, and that's probably when it was at its most successful in the sort of mid-90s.
So in 1997, you actually joined Chelsea as head of communications, working for the legendary Ken Bates. In his autobiography, former Tottenham chairman Irving Scholar referred to Ken Bates and many other smaller club chairmen as the bearded barbarian whose bark was worse than his bite. Although he was aggressive, he always came across as a very clear thinking man. Was that your experience of Ken Bates?
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty good description. It was a fascinating guy to work for. I knew his partner, Susanna. She was a journalist. And she just said to me, she just phoned me one day, said, look, Ken's working on something. He'd like to meet you. He'd like to pick your brains on something. So I went along and had lunch with him. And he bought a football magazine, basically, an old one, kind of off the shelf, that he wanted to bring back. And I sat down at lunch. I said, don't do it. I said, it's a crowded market. It's not a great idea. Unless you want to spend a lot of money on it, which I'm guessing you don't. I wouldn't do it if I was you. So I thought that was probably the end of it. But then he contacted me and said, look, I've got other things. Why don't you come and work with us here at Chelsea? And even though it was pretty difficult as a Tottenham fan to go and work for another club. But I thought it was quite an exciting opportunity. I could see sort of football was changing, the whole nature of football was changing. And I thought it might be an interesting time to do it. But yeah, I mean, he was incredibly hands-on. It was a time when they were building Chelsea Village, the hotel and everything. And you kind of wander around. He'd say, come on, we're going for a walk. He just fancied a bit of company. And then we'd sort of wander around the site with these hard hats on. And he'd telling all the builders to, here, finish your lunch and get on with it. And it was, he was just so hands-on. I'm sure Daniel Levy was pretty similar when they were doing the Spurs thing. I mean, in fact, I've heard people say he was very similar. But essentially, very, very hands-on at every level. I mean, to the point where I'd get in the mornings, and if he got in half an hour before me, he would have opened all my posts and written on it, tell them, no, this isn't a bad idea. See me about this. So I'd say, well, can I go home now then? I mean, it's just, so what are you opening? He said, I don't know what I like. But it was kind of done in I mean, he was always quite irascible. But the other thing, little things, you get in a taxi with him. And I just see the drivers, if they'd, oh, hello, Mr. Bates, if he'd been in a cab with them before, because many of them had, they knew what was coming. First thing he'd say, never mind that, which way are you going? And they'd say, well, I'm going to go over Chelsea Bridge. They said, no, don't go that way. So he was just that kind of guy, It was like telling the cabbie where to go. So, look, it was never a dull moment. And I always got on very well with him. I mean, I only stayed there, it was quite a lot of politics, but there was nothing to do with the chairman. And I always got on very well with him. And I didn't have an issue with him. That's not why I only lasted just over a year at Chelsea.
But was it exciting to be a bit more on the inside of professional football? Because you'd been a reporter or journalist, people writing about, but kind of from on the outside. Now you were actually on the inside of it. And did it affect the way you thought about football?
Yeah, I mean, one of the toughest things was I had to check it's funny enough, I was talking to a friend's daughter the other day who's working at West Ham. She's a big Spurs fan like me. She's working at West Ham. And she said we as she was talking about it. And I said, that's a slippery slope. I did that when I was at Chelsea. I remember saying we, and I thought, what? It's not we, it's they. It's I'm going to have to separate these two worlds. And I found that difficult at times. So, look, generally, it wasn't a major problem. But I did, it was very interesting to be on the inside of a football club. Something I did realise quite early on is that when it actually came down to it, if you stripped away the fact it was the Premier League and the money, it was basically still a Sunday morning team with knobs on. All the same sort of dramas were going on, all the same sort of relationships. And fundamentally, it doesn't matter how much they were earning. You had to get 11 blokes out on a football pitch. And whether that's Hackney Marshes or Stamford Bridge, is the same process. Coaches were the same blokes, really, pretty and certainly in those days. Although, obviously, Ruud Gullit was there at that time, and then I left kind of as Luca Vialli came in. But yeah, essentially it was an eye opener, a good and bad at times, I'd say.
So how did you make the leap into TV production and Fantasy World Cup in 1998?
Well, I wasn't particularly enjoying it at Chelsea. As I said, that wasn't Ken Bates' fault really, but there was some other stuff going on politically behind the scenes, and I wasn't particularly enjoying it. And I knew Andy Jacobs. I'd met Andy Jacobs. Well, I'd spoken to him on the phone. I don't think I'd actually met him at that stage. He was producing fantasy football with Skinner and Badil. He was, as Frank calls him, like the Roy Keane of the production, the kind of attack dog, the third wheel on that show. He was very important to it. And he was the series producer. And he called me and said, I'm looking for a couple of young researchers to work on these live World Cup shows. Always before it had been a weekly pre-recorded show on the BBC, but ITV had taken it on, and we're going to do a live show every day for a month, 7 days a week, every evening, just after about sort of 10:30, 10:40 after the games. And did I know a couple of junior researchers? And I gave them a couple of names of guys, one of which, Gordon Thompson, who was great writer and a really good operator. He ended up working on the production. Ian Morris was one of the research team on that series. James Bobin, who's a sort of Hollywood director, did the Muppets movie, shot a lot of the Phoenixes. I mean, Andy was good at that. Andy was a good sort of talent spotter. I mean, most of the people, Spencer Millman was a researcher. Spencer's producing the new iteration of fantasy football. He's producing that now. He also produced TV Burt, won a BAFTA for that. So all these guys went on. Dean Nabarro's TV producer as well, all went on to do good things. So yeah, lots and lots of different people sort of came through that show. But I just found myself saying to Andy when he was asking me about the researchers, you haven't got anything for me, have you? This sounds like fun. Because I knew Frank used to do a column for 90 minutes. So Andy said, well, okay, leave it with me. And he came back about half an hour later and said, yeah, Frank and David love you on board. We need a football producer, another producer to help out on that side, to get the football, the feel of it right, to get the Phoenixes right, to help out on ideas and creative stuff. So yeah, that's how I ended up. I just decided I took a bit of a hit in salary. I remember going out with a mate that night saying, I'm going to take a bit of a kicking financially, but this sounds like fun. It's going to be hard work, but I think if you're going to go into a different area that you don't particularly know, I think you probably don't expect to be earning the money in an area in which you do. So I had to take a hit, but I thought it was a chance worth taking. And so I went off and did that, the fantasy football shows.
Were there any Phoenix from the Flames that you tried to get off the ground that didn't happen for whatever reason?
Yeah, we had one there was quite a few. I think Andy had discovered that before. Often people would say yes. And it was very annoying because, people, they might write the script and then the person pulls out. I don't think sometimes, even football, they're probably footballers now, just think they'll say yes one minute and no the next without thinking about the collateral damage of that and the fact someone has written and started to set up a whole shoot. But there was one that I was kind of managing through with Jurgen Klinsmann. We wanted to have the first player red carded in a World Cup final, Italia 90, Pedro Monzon, the Argentinian, who was sent off. But the obvious person to go for was Jurgen Klinsmann in that final. So we approached his agent and they said, yeah, he said he'd like to do it. He'd like you to make a donation to Bernardo's. And they said, yeah, whatever you want, you'll get a fee for doing it. That's fantastic. But yeah, would you mind? He said, no, that's going to be fine. So the guys wrote the script. And obviously, Jurgen, I mean, even in later years, he was quite happy to take the mickey out of himself diving, as he proved when he went to Spurs in the Sheffield Wednesday game, when he was kind of faux diving on the pitch. But at that time, I still think it was his agent who was touchy about it, not him. And the guys produced the script that at one point he's tackled. I think it was David as Klinsmann. He's tackled. And then you get a gymnast double going in doing flick flacks and back somersaults and, taking the piss out of the diving. And we sent the script over. And again, I think it was probably the agent saying, no, he doesn't want to do any of that ironic shit, which was the actual phrase that I had to take back to David and Frank. And I said, well, look, that's the show. That's what the show is. We can't write this. It's not a puff piece. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be a comedy. But to cut a long story short, it didn't happen. But the guys had sort of written the Phoenix. It was all written. And so we had to reshape it to track down Pedro Monzon, who was the Argentinian player, sort of 8 years on, who'd been sent off in that game. And he hadn't stayed in football. He was working in a sports center somewhere in Argentina, just outside Buenos Aires. So it took some tracking down to find this guy. But our guys did. And he came over and did the Phoenix from a different perspective. I mean, if I ever turned and said to Jurgen Klinsmann, I met him afterwards and I should have mentioned it, and I spoke to him since. But I bet if I said to him, do you remember when you turned down the opportunity to do that? He probably wouldn't even know. So it was a great shame because I think he would have been great in it. And I think he proved afterwards he could laugh at that. But that was the one that springs to mind, getting old Pedro Monzon, slightly bemused man, phoning him up and saying, would you come over to England and go to Hendon Football Club and go through one of the worst moments of your career?
As you said, Fantasy World Cup was where you met your Talksport hosting partner, Andy Jacobs. But before you went to Talk Radio, I think you had a period where you teamed up to head development at UK indie TV producer Avalon Television. And I read that Andy was quoted as saying, we just ended up sitting in an office all day, staring at each other and playing games.
Well, look, that was in development. That's work. In TV development, that's work because there's two things that are going on. You've got, I mean, Avalon is an agent. It's got a lot of talent. Frank's still there, Al Murray, lots and lots of people. Taskmaster has come out of Avalon. So they're a production company, and they're much bigger now than they were then at that stage. But most of their production was built around the talent. So we were trying to come up with formats for the acts that they had there. And we did stuff with Jenny Eclair and Lee Mack and worked up some ideas with Simon Day that were all talent there. And then people would come to them to try and get ideas off the ground. But an awful lot of that, I mean and amongst it, a lot of that is just shooting the breeze. It's like, what about a quiz where you do this or you do that? What about a show that's like that we could attach Lee or somebody like that to? So an awful lot of it was shooting the breeze. And we were trying to come up, we had some good ideas. We had some good sports format ideas that we couldn't quite get away, but sport was always part of that. And so we started on a Friday afternoon, people would wander up to our office and we'd look at the fixtures that weekend. And we just started to kind of, all of us had a little league table going. So 4 or 5 people would come up and we'd say, well, they've got no chance of winning tomorrow. I reckon that's going to be 2-0 easy. So we record the scores. And that's what effectively the Fools panel was in 90 minutes and what it still is on TalkSport every Friday, where you got 3 points for getting it right. But some of these chats were quite funny. Sometimes the comedians, some of the acts would wander up and get involved. And these chats were quite funny as we sort of took the piss out of our own predictions or just talked about players as we did that. So that was kind of the sort of start of that, really. And I suppose quite a lot of what we took onto those early radio pilots that they asked us to do a show on Talk Radio, as it was then, was an extension of that, really.
So 20 plus years later, you're now at Talksport with the Hawksbee and Jacobs show. Were you nervous making that move into performing, given what you said earlier about sort of a fear of performing?
Do you know, it's interesting because I appeared, when I was the 90 Minutes editor, they asked me to be a manager on the fantasy football show they did on radio with Nick Hancock. Then Dominic Diamond took it on, had various hosts, but it would have sort of celebrity or journalists as the team managers, and they'd pick their own fantasy football team. And as the editor of 90 Minutes, they asked me to do that. And I always kind of felt when I did it, I don't know, I was a bit self-conscious and I never really gave the best of myself and I never completely loosened up towards the end of it when it was kind of almost too late and I started to have a bit more fun with it. So I left doing that. When that series finished, I thought to myself, you know, sometimes in life you don't kind of feel like you're giving the best of yourself. You feel like you sort of sold yourself a bit short. And I mean, in any profession, you can feel like sometimes that you could have done better. You could have left a bit more out there. And so when the opportunity to do this with Andy had done hospital radio years ago. So I always say he got sacked for playing I Will Survive for Ken in intensive care, which he claims isn't true, but probably was about right. So he'd always wanted to go back to doing radio. And he knew Tom Watt. He'd worked with Tom Watt before. Tom was at Talk. And he said, who would I need to talk to about the possibility of maybe trying out to do a bit of radio? So he contacted the controller, and the guy said, look, we've got an internet station. Why don't you come along and do a show? So he said to me, would you like to do it with me? Would you like to try out? So we went along to Talk Studios and did this, effectively a pilot that only went out on the internet, not on the station. And the controller liked it. He phoned us the following day. I've listened back. He said, it's great. He said, do you fancy doing a show this Saturday? Because Tom Watt and Gary Newbon, who were presenting the show at the time, were off. So that's the first kind of show we did. And all we really did, I mean, it's effectively the same sort of things we would try and present to Frank and Dave as ideas when we were working with them. But it was sort of us firing the bullets, obviously not as well as those two. But that was it, really. It was just an extension of that relationship that we'd had when we've been writing together to take onto the radio. So I kind of vowed that I would try and hopefully give a bit more of myself and not be sort of self-conscious. I don't think you can be. You have to be. I mean, I think people often say to me, well, how do you get into radio? What do you do to get into radio? I always think you've got to be sort of authentic. I don't think I'm a great deal different off than I am on. And I think that's key, because so many people put on a radio voice, or they're just sort of different people when they get on the air. And I don't see the point of that, really. I can't see how you can do that properly. So, so here we are.
And is Andy as irascible off air as he is on the show?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I mean, when England lose a game of cricket, as they did yesterday against Ireland, or Chelsea have lost, yeah, he is borderline psychotic. It is. I know. I mean, even yesterday we had an old Ireland cricketer come on after that game, and I said, I'm not going to get him on unless you play nice. He said, I'll be nice. I said, I know you won't be. Just try and be a bit nicer than you would normally be. So, yeah, I mean, that's not an act. But you know, he's not like that all the time. Obviously, it wouldn't work. But when things like that have happened, he does take them incredibly personally, and that obviously comes across on the air.
In a way, you're sort of a modern day version of the Two Ronnies, right? You've got the big guy and the little guy, and have that sort of those comedic personas that exist on the station. But that's something that just comes naturally. It wasn't ever contrived to be that.
No, it's just us. It was us talking in that office when we worked at Avalon. It was just us working together on fantasy football and the relationship we had. And that's effectively the same thing that you hear on the radio. We took onto that.
So you've worked across comedy and broadcasting, but also on the sports side as well. How do you deal with high-performing, talented people? Because you've worked with Al Murray, you've worked with Harry Hill, you know, quite intimately, Frankie Howerd and the Two Ronnies in the early days, but also you were working your way through sports publishing and actually a professional football club. Is there a way of dealing with these very high-performing, really strong creative types that you've developed over the years, do you think?
I think it depends on the person. I think, you know, like anybody else, you kind of try and size somebody up if you're working with them fairly quickly, and you kind of know the buttons to push. I think sometimes, I mean, not so much on the comedy side, not massively so. I found, you know, obviously on the sports side, some of these sort of people need their ego stroked a little bit more. I found generally, I mean, working with Harry, I sort of work with him, still work with him. That's a lot of fun. That's a joy. We always had a lot of fun making TV burpers. We have all the TV projects we've done with Harry because he makes it a fun experience. It is hard work, but no one works harder than him on that. Certainly on that show or in any shows we do. So he always leads from the front, and he makes the meetings fun. And that was a joy. I mean, I was trying to balance that. Was effectively doing 2 full-time jobs with Burp and the radio, and it was hard going, but I just enjoyed the process of working with Harry and Dan Meyer and David Quantick and Brenda Gilhooly and Spencer and people like that. It was a fun process. So I was always happy to go back and do more. But I think sometimes it's like any other business. You kind of you work out what makes people tick and how you can get how you can do your best for them and get the best out of them by doing what you do, really.
Very good. Well, in the past, on this part of the podcast, I've asked people for their lockdown media, what would get them through a lockdown in terms of film, book, TV, and music choice. But we want lockdown to be behind us now. And so it's time to try and find something new. And I'm a massive fan of the birthday spread, I have to admit. It's something that I play with my wife. And,
good.
So
good. It's good other people are playing it.
Yeah, we compete with each other. So
on the radio one, or do you play your own version?
No, we listen to the podcast.
Oh, okay, sure.
And so we can play along and we compete against each other as well as against you guys. So you're smashing all comers and all opposition, and so you're clearly a top quiz guy. And so what I wanted to do was challenge you to a little bit of a quiz.
Wow.
And so what I wanted to do was channel my inner Bruce Forsyth to do a bit of higher and lower, but not with cards, but with football stadium capacities, benchmarked against the world famous home of the Spurs, the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So if you're up for the challenge, I will give you the stadium and you need to say whether its capacity is higher or lower than Tottenham Hotspur's 62,850. What do you think?
Play your stadiums, play your stadia, right? Which is an ugly title for a game show, isn't it? Really.
Could workshop that a bit, but you get the point. And I have a lot of American listeners, so they will probably think that this Chelsea Football Club are absolutely massive and having been bought for billions of dollars. But is Stamford Bridge higher or lower than the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium?
Lower, as Bruce would say. I'm delighted to say, unless they ever redevelop it or move.
Very much lower. Spurs 62,850. Small club Chelsea 40,341, which is only right for a small club. So next week Spurs are playing Marseille at the Stade Velodrome. Is that higher or lower?
The Stade Velodrome, I think slightly lower.
It's actually higher.
Really?
Its official capacity is 67,394.
But not by much. I was thinking it was probably sort of 50 odd. Late 50s. So I thought it was going to be close, but not higher.
Okay. Emirates Stadium, home of Arsenal Football Club.
No, that's one of the great joys, isn't it? I mean, Daniel Levy, out of spite, I think, decided to squeeze an extra couple of thousand seats in. So higher.
Yeah, lower. So yeah, Emirates is lower.
Oh, lower. Sorry, lower.
Yes.
We're higher. They're lower, of course.
Yes, at 60,784, that is lower. And again, just to try and give my American listeners something to think about, Dodger Stadium.
Dodger Stadium, I'm trying to think the size of, I've not been there. I would say higher, but not by much.
Lower,
okay.
Lower. 56,000 official.
56. Okay, so lower, but not by much. Yeah.
The Allianz Arena in Munich.
Isn't that about 70 odd? Oh, that's higher.
75,000, home of Bayern Munich, massive stadium. Celtic Park.
It's probably in the vicinity, isn't it, of our place? I'd say slightly lower as an all-seater. Never used to be before, but I think it is,
Slightly lower, 60,832. And the final one, the Michigan University Stadium.
Now, that must be a trick question. It's probably, I'm going to go higher because it shouldn't be, but it is.
Yeah, so when I was at university, and my university had actually hosted an FA Cup final, and we would get probably one man and his dog. But at the Michigan Stadium, they can hold 107,601 people. So,
wow, wait.
That's on another scale, but so many things are in America. Well, Paul Hawksbee, thank you so much for being a guest. It's been a fascinating insight and tour into a career that spans so many different areas. And that's been wonderful. And I will be tuning in later to the Hawksbee and Jacobs podcast and the birthday spread, and hoping that my marriage survives another evening, depending on who wins out of my wife and I as we listen to it.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks a lot.